A billionaire worth billions slips out of his penthouse in disguise. No security, no phone, no one who knows where he is. He just wants one quiet night as an ordinary man. But the moment he sits down at a steakhouse and orders a steak, a waitress slides a folded note under his napkin that stops him cold. 7 words that tell him everything he thought he knew about his company, his closest ally, and his own life is about to fall apart. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The city never really went quiet. Even past 10 on a Tuesday night, Chicago kept its noise, truck engines rumbling down wide streets, a distant train rattling over elevated tracks, the low hum of wind cutting between towers of glass and steel. Arthur Calloway had lived above most of that noise for years. Literally, his penthouse sat on the 53rd floor of a building he technically owned, and from that height the city looked manageable, organized, controlled. But tonight, Arthur wasn't up there. He stood on the sidewalk like any other tired man with nowhere particular to be. His coat was old and loose, the kind of coat a person picks up from a donation bin without looking at the size. His boots were scuffed along the toes. His beard had been growing for 3 weeks without trimming, thick and gray at the edges, and it aged him by about 15 years. He had chosen every detail of this appearance deliberately, the way he used to choose every detail of a business plan, carefully, quietly, and with full understanding of what he wanted people to see. He wanted them to see nothing worth remembering. Arthur had done this several times over the past month. Slipped out of the building through a side entrance, left his phone upstairs, left his security detail behind with some invented excuse about needing rest, and walked. Just walked. Through neighborhoods his company's trucks rolled through every single day, but that he himself hadn't stood inside in years. He told himself he was simply clearing his head, reconnecting. But if he was honest, and on these long, quiet walks he sometimes managed to be, he was looking for something he had misplaced without fully noticing. 3 weeks ago, 2 senior vice presidents had been quietly removed from the company after a routine audit revealed that expense accounts had been manipulated for years. It wasn't the money that bothered Arthur. He had spent enough years in business to know that people sometimes let greed make small, stupid decisions. What bothered him was that he hadn't seen it coming. He had sat across from these men at dinner, at board meetings, at his son Daniel's memorial service, and he had seen nothing. And then there was the anniversary itself. 10 years since Daniel died at 23 in a car accident outside of Indianapolis. Arthur had been in Tokyo for a deal that week and had taken the red-eye home when he got the call, arriving just in time for the worst moment of his life. Every year around that date, something in him went a little dim. This year it had gone dimmer than usual. So he walked. He had no destination in mind when he turned down Weston Avenue that evening. But Benson Steakhouse stopped him the way certain buildings do when something about them feels slightly out of place. It sat between a modern office tower and a block of older storefronts that had seen better decades. The building itself was respectable, brick facade, polished brass handle on the door, a menu display case mounted by the entrance with prices that suggested it served people in suits, not people in worn boots. But the sign above the door had one flickering letter, and the window nearest the entrance had a long, thin crack sealed with clear tape that someone had forgotten to replace with actual glass. Arthur looked at it for a moment. Then he pushed the door open and went inside. The dining room was about 2/3 full. White tablecloths, low lighting, the kind of background music chosen to suggest elegance without committing to it. The air smelled like grilled meat and warm bread and, very faintly, cleaning solution. Several heads turned when Arthur walked in. He was used to people looking at him, though usually for the opposite reason. Tonight the looks were different, the quick flicker of discomfort that people show when something doesn't fit the picture they expected. A man in a worn coat stepping into a $60 entree restaurant. He ignored it completely and found a table near the center of the room, pulling out the chair and sitting down with the calm ease of someone who ate in places like this every day. Because he did, just not usually dressed like this. He picked up the menu and began reading it. He was 3 lines in when he felt someone watching him in a different way than the other diners had. Not startled, not uncomfortable, just watching. He didn't look up immediately. He had learned years ago that you learn more about a room by reading people in your peripheral vision than by staring directly at them. The man approaching from the right side of the room was in his 40s, well-dressed in a manager's dark jacket with a small gold pin on the lapel. He moved with the particular walk of someone who had decided something before they left their desk and was now arriving to carry it out. His name tag read Harold. His expression read problem. "Good evening," the man said, stopping beside Arthur's table without pulling out a notepad or offering anything remotely like a welcome. "I'm afraid we're fully committed for the evening. Every table is reserved." Arthur looked up slowly. He let a moment pass. "I'm sitting at one." Harold Denton's jaw tightened slightly. "That table is held for a reservation that arrives shortly. I can offer you the name of another establishment nearby that." "There are 4 empty tables I can count from where I'm sitting," Arthur said quietly. His voice was even, not confrontational, just accurate. Harold straightened. He was preparing to say something firmer when a voice arrived from behind him. "I've got this table, Harold." The woman who stepped around the manager was in her late 20s, black, with her hair pulled back and a notepad tucked under her arm. She had the practiced, neutral expression of someone who had learned to keep their face professionally unreadable. But her eyes were different. They were paying close attention. Harold turned to look at her. Something passed between them, his irritation, her quiet insistence. And then Harold stepped back. "Fine," he said flatly, and walked away without another word. The waitress turned to Arthur with a clean smile that had nothing artificial in it. "Sorry about that. Can I start you with some water?" "Please," Arthur said. She filled his glass from a pitcher on the service tray and handed him the menu without any of the slight condescension he had half expected given the way the rest of the room had greeted his appearance. He watched her for a moment as she straightened the salt and pepper shakers on the table. She was observant. He could see it in the way she moved. The small adjustments she made as she walked, stepping slightly around a busboy without looking directly at him, noting a nearby table's near-empty wine glasses without being called over. She was the kind of person who cataloged a room automatically without deciding to. He filed that away and looked back at his menu. When she came back, he ordered the dry-aged ribeye, the most expensive item listed. She wrote it down without raising an eyebrow, though he caught the slight pause before she clicked her pen closed. Not judgment, more like confirmation, as if something she already suspected had just been proven. "Any sides?" she asked. "Roasted potatoes," Arthur said. "And tell the kitchen not to rush it." "Of course." She tucked the notepad back under her arm. "I'll be back with your bread." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, and for just a half second, barely anything, hardly worth noticing, she slowed. Not stopped, just slowed, the way a person does when they're deciding something. Arthur studied the room while he waited. Old habit. He had walked into thousands of spaces over the decades. Warehouses, boardrooms, port facilities, government offices, and he had always taken the first few minutes to understand the geography. Where the exits were. Who was paying attention to what? Where the tension was pooling. It was pooling in 2 places tonight. Harold Denton, the manager, had retreated to a position near the host stand where he could watch Arthur's table without being obvious about it. He wasn't obvious enough. Every couple of minutes his eyes came back to the same spot. And then there was the corner table. 2 men. Business attire, which fit the restaurant, but something about their presence didn't match the room's rhythm. Other diners ate, talked, checked their phones with the relaxed self-involvement of people who had come for a meal. These 2 sat like people who had come a wait. Their food was mostly untouched. One of them had his phone face down on the table and kept turning it over every few minutes to check it. The other held his menu in front of his face, but his eyes cleared the top of it regularly, sweeping the room in a pattern that was too deliberate to be casual. The bread arrived, set down by a busboy. Arthur pulled a piece apart without eating it and kept watching. When Naomi returned to refill his water, she set the pitcher down and slid something beneath the edge of his napkin in the same motion, so smoothly that a person looking directly at the table wouldn't have registered it as 2 separate actions. Arthur looked down. A small square of folded paper. He waited until she had moved 3 steps away before he reached for it. He unfolded it slowly, keeping it below the level of the table. 7 words. Block letters. Written firmly, like someone who had decided well before writing them. You shouldn't be here, Mr. Calloway. They're watching you. Arthur did not move. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on his knee and lifted his water glass with one hand because his hands needed something to do, and he was not going to let them sit still where anyone could read them. He looked across the dining room. Naomi was at another table, asking a couple about dessert, her back 3/4 to Arthur. She did not glance over. She did not check whether he had read it. She was either a very good actor or she was genuinely giving him space to process what she had just handed him, and somehow that made it worse. An amateur trying to shake him would have looked. She didn't. No one outside of his private security team knew Arthur Calloway was in this restaurant tonight. He had told no one. He had left his phone upstairs, left his security lead a note saying he was going to sleep early, and come out through the side entrance without so much as logging the trip in any calendar or record. The only way someone in this building knew his name was if they had been specifically watching for him. He looked at the 2 men in the corner again. One of them had just made a phone call. Arthur ate slowly and deliberately, taking his time with the bread and keeping his face pointed at the room in a way that would look, to anyone watching, like a man simply enjoying his meal. Inside, he was running through every possible explanation, testing each one and discarding it. The most obvious possibility was that Naomi was part of whatever the 2 men in the corner represented, sent to approach him, to manage his reaction, to keep him calm and seated while something else was arranged. But the note wasn't calming. It was alarming. If she wanted to keep him seated and manageable, telling him people were watching him was a strange way to do it. The second possibility was that she genuinely recognized him and was trying to warn him about something she had observed. That was harder to dismiss, partly because of the precision of the note. She hadn't written, "I think you might be in danger." She had written his name, which meant she was certain. His steak arrived. Naomi set the plate down with both hands, leaning forward slightly in the way servers do when they're checking that the presentation is right. Her voice was low enough that it barely cleared the distance between her face and his ear. "Don't react," she said. Her tone had none of the professional warmth from before. It was flat and direct, the voice of someone who had decided there was no more time for politeness. "If you value your life, leave through the kitchen in 10 minutes. She straightened, tucked the tray under her arm, and asked at normal volume whether he'd like fresh ground pepper on the steak. "No, thank you," Arthur said. She walked away. Arthur looked at his steak. Then he picked up his fork and cut into it because sitting there staring at his plate after a warning like that was not an option he was going to take. He chewed. He thought, 10 years ago, maybe even 5, Arthur Calloway might have reached for his phone, called his security lead, and had the building surrounded within 12 minutes. He had the resources for it. He had used them before when situations called for it. But he hadn't stayed at the top of a company for 30 years by only responding to things directly. The most valuable information had always come from letting a situation breathe long enough to show you its shape. The 2 men in the corner were growing impatient. He could see it in the way the second one had stopped pretending to look at his menu and was now watching the room openly, not quite making eye contact with Arthur, but pointing his attention in that direction like a spotlight someone forgot to aim slightly more to the left. Harold Denton had disappeared into the back office. Arthur ate another cut of steak. It was, he noted without particular pleasure, excellently prepared. He decided to stay. Arthur was still at his table 7 minutes after the warning, working through the steak with the patient focus of a man with nothing on his mind but dinner. The restaurant hummed around him. Silverware clicked against plates. A woman at the next table laughed at something her companion said, and the background music shifted into something slow and instrumental that no one was actually listening to. At the corner table, the 2 men were no longer even pretending. One of them had pushed his plate aside. The other was leaning forward on his elbows, scanning the room every 30 seconds with the tight efficiency of someone running a check on a situation they no longer fully controlled. They hadn't looked at Arthur directly yet, which meant they were being careful, but their attention was circling his table the way weather circles a pressure point. Naomi came to refill his water glass. She poured without hurrying, keeping her eyes on the glass. Arthur kept his voice low enough that only she could have heard it under the ambient noise of the room. "How do you know my name?" She set the picture down and looked at him for the first time directly since the note. Her expression was composed in a way that had nothing casual about it. It was the composure of someone who had been holding something tightly for a long time and had gotten good at making that look like calm. "Because I've been waiting for you to show up here," she said. Arthur set down his fork. She didn't elaborate. She picked up the picture, adjusted the napkin holder at the edge of the table with one hand, and walked back toward the service station. Arthur watched her go. He had spent 3 decades reading people in boardrooms, across negotiating tables, in the middle of deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He could generally tell within the first few minutes of meeting someone whether they were telling him the truth, managing the truth, or replacing the truth entirely with something they'd rehearsed. Naomi Carter wasn't doing any of those things. She was telling him something real and choosing how much of it to release at any given moment. That was different. That was the behavior of someone with a plan. He picked his fork back up and finished the steak. Meanwhile, the 2 men in the corner were making more calls. The one with the phone-down habit had now made 3 calls in 12 minutes. The calls were short, under a minute each, and he spoke with his face turned toward the wall, the posture of someone relaying a status update rather than having a conversation. The other man had checked his watch 4 times in the last few minutes, which was one of those small tells that people never noticed they had. Harold Denton emerged from the back office and made a slow pass through the dining room, pausing briefly near the corner table. It was subtle, just a server-side check disguised as a manager making his rounds. But Arthur noticed that no words were exchanged, and yet both Denton and the sitting man appeared to exhale slightly after the pass, the way people do after a wordless confirmation. Denton was connected to those 2 men. Arthur was now certain of it. He was still sitting with that when Naomi returned. She was carrying a small dessert menu in one hand and set it on the table with her left hand while her right slid a folded piece of receipt paper beneath the edge of his side plate. Smaller than the first note. Folded tight. She pointed at 2 items on the dessert menu and said something about the nightly special with the practiced rhythm of someone who had made the same recommendation hundreds of times. Arthur nodded at the appropriate moments. When she moved on, he palmed the note under the table and read it with his hands in his lap. "They think you're alone. Don't prove them wrong." He read it twice, then folded it once more and tucked it into his coat pocket alongside the first one. "Don't prove them wrong." That wasn't a warning about tonight being dangerous. That was information about what the men in the corner believed, which meant Naomi knew something about what they expected to find here. And if she knew what they expected, she knew who had sent them. Arthur set his napkin on the table, pushed back his chair, and stood up. He stretched briefly, the natural movement of someone who had been sitting for 40 minutes, and then walked toward the far end of the dining room in the general direction of the restrooms. Naomi appeared in his peripheral vision almost immediately, stepping out from beside the service counter and moving to intercept at an angle that would look, to anyone watching, like a server redirecting a guest. "Order correction," she said quietly, tilting her head slightly toward the kitchen hallway. "I need you to step back with me for just a moment." The kitchen was loud and hot, the kind of controlled chaos that had no attention to spare for a server and a customer walking through the back hallway. Cooks called out times, pans hit the range, a dishwasher ran at full pressure somewhere deeper in the building. No one glanced up. Naomi led Arthur down a narrow hallway off the main kitchen, past a rack of dry goods and a shelf of extra linens. She stopped and turned to face him. Her voice dropped to just above a whisper, but it was steady. "Those 2 men have been coming in here for 3 weeks, she said. "They always request a corner table with sight lines to the entrance. They stay 2 hours, they barely eat, and they leave a cash tip that's double the check. Last week I overheard them on a call. They used your name." Arthur studied her face. "And you decided not to call the police." "I considered it, but what I overheard suggested the people they're working for have reach. Calling the police felt like calling the wrong number." She paused. "I made a different decision. The notes. I recognized you the moment you walked in. The watch. The way you held your shoulders. I knew what I was looking at." Her eyes stayed level. "I'd seen your photograph often enough." "How long have you worked here?" 14 months. Before that, something shifted in her face. Just slightly. That's the part that matters, she said. She reached up to the low ceiling of the hallway and turned the angle of a small camera mounted near a junction box. It had been aimed down the hallway. Now, she pointed it at the wall. These were installed 6 months ago, she said. The restaurant's owner doesn't know about them. I found them when I was cleaning the hallway storage unit. Whoever put them in was checking whether employees use this hallway regularly. She looked at Arthur. They've been using this restaurant as a staging point. Arthur said nothing for a moment. He looked at the camera, then back at Naomi. How does a waitress know that someone inside my company told them I'd be here tonight? He said. Naomi looked at him steadily. She had the expression of someone who had been holding a door shut for a long time and had finally decided to open it. Because I used to work for your company, she said. Callaway Freight Systems. I was a logistics analyst. 3 years ago, I was let go during a restructuring. The pieces arrived in the wrong order, the way they sometimes do. Not a clean line from one fact to the next, but a cluster that landed all at once and rearranged the room. Arthur stared at her. You were investigating something, he said. It wasn't a question. Irregular shipments, Naomi said. Routes that didn't match any client contracts I could find on record. Cargo manifests with reference numbers that didn't exist in the system but were signed off at the senior level. I flagged it internally. She paused. 2 weeks later, I was called into HR and told my position had been eliminated. From somewhere in the front of the restaurant came the sound of chairs being pushed back. Naomi's eyes moved past Arthur toward the kitchen. Her voice became quicker, lower. They're looking for you. They've left the corner table. She met his eyes. Mr. Callaway, someone inside your company's leadership has been running a criminal operation through your freight network for years. Someone who knew you'd be out alone tonight. She held his gaze for a moment, making sure the weight of it landed. Someone in your inner circle is trying to kill you. The kitchen noise continued around them. Pans, voices, running water, while the rest of the world seemed to slow down to the width of a service hallway. Arthur had been told many things over the years that changed the direction of decisions he'd already made. He had heard unexpected numbers in quarterly reports, unexpected betrayals in legal filings, unexpected news delivered by phone at 35,000 feet. He had learned to receive bad information without visibly reacting to it, because reacting gave other people a roadmap into what mattered to you. He didn't react now. But behind his eyes, something old and careful and very awake came forward. The part of him that had built a logistics empire from a single lease truck at the age of 24. The part that didn't stop moving when the ground moved under it. Footsteps were audible now at the kitchen door. A voice, clipped, unfamiliar, asked one of the cooks if they'd seen a man in a dark coat come through. Naomi turned without another word and moved further down the hallway, pushing open a metal door that let in a rush of cold night air and the smell of wet pavement. She held it open with one hand and looked back at him. Arthur walked through it. The alley behind the restaurant was narrow and dark, the only light coming from a single fixture above a loading dock 2 buildings down. The rain had started at some point, not heavy, just present, the kind of rain that existed more as moisture than as actual drops. Arthur turned up his collar and stayed close to the wall, while Naomi let the door close silently behind him. From inside the restaurant, muffled and confused, came the sounds of 2 men who had lost track of the person they were supposed to be watching. Arthur looked up the alley toward the street. Where are we going? He asked quietly. Naomi glanced both ways before stepping away from the wall. Somewhere we can talk, she said, and somewhere I can show you what I've spent 3 years putting together. Arthur followed her into the rain. The rain had picked up by the time they reached the end of the alley. Naomi moved quickly, but without the frantic energy of someone running scared. More like someone who had rehearsed this route in her head and was now simply executing it. Arthur kept pace beside her, his worn coat darkening at the shoulders from the rain, his eyes moving across the street ahead with the focused quiet of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about his evening. 2 blocks from the restaurant, she flagged cab. They rode in silence for several minutes, Naomi watching the side mirror with one hand resting on her knee, Arthur watching the streets slide past, and thinking about the 2 men who had been sitting in that corner booth like they owned the room. You asked me back in the hallway if I was testing you, Naomi said, without turning from the window. I didn't say that. You were thinking it. She glanced at him. You spent the first 2 minutes in that hallway deciding whether I was part of it. Arthur said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. It's the right instinct, she said. You should keep it. The cab stopped on a quiet block in Wicker Park. Naomi paid in cash and led him up the front steps of a narrow 3-flat. Unlocking the door to the ground floor unit with a key she kept separate from her other keys. A deliberate separation, Arthur noted. Inside, she flipped one lamp on and nothing else. The apartment was small and plain, the kind of furnished rental that came with mismatched shares and a landlord who never dropped by. It looked, at a casual glance, like any other modest apartment. But the walls were something else entirely. Arthur stood in the center of the room and looked at it the way he used to look at the large operations maps in the early years of Callaway Freight, taking in the overall shape before the details. There were papers pinned in clusters, connected by lines drawn in different colors of marker. Shipping route maps overlaid with handwritten annotations. Printouts of financial documents with certain figures circled. Photographs of cargo containers at port facilities he recognized. Names. Dates. Account numbers. He walked closer. Ask me something, Naomi said from behind him. She had taken off her server apron and hung it by the door. Something that only someone inside the company would know. Arthur turned slightly. The name of the logistics software platform Callaway Freight switched to in 2019. Meridian Track. The contract was awarded to a vendor in Atlanta after the original provider was dropped following a data breach in Q3 of 2018. The decision was made by the Operations Committee, chaired at the time by Victor Hale. Arthur's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The internal code name for the Pacific Rim Expansion Project, Coastline, filed under development projects in the second quarter of 2020. It was presented to the board as a market expansion, but the actual port access agreements were structured in a way that gave 3 specific facilities priority routing rights that weren't disclosed in the board summary. Arthur turned to face her fully. I was good at my job, Naomi said, not with pride, just with the flatness of fact. That's why they got rid of me. He believed her, not because the answers were correct, though they were, but because of the way she delivered them. There was no performance in it. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply telling him the truth, and the truth was that she had spent a significant portion of her adult life paying attention to things most people walk past. Tell me about the shipments, Arthur said. Naomi moved to the wall and pointed to a cluster of documents near the center. I first noticed them about 8 months into my time at the company. Manifest for freight moving through 3 of our Gulf Coast terminals that didn't match any client contracts in the active database. The cargo designations were generic, industrial components, manufacturing equipment, but the weights were inconsistent with what those designations should have been. And the routing was strange. Legitimate freight doesn't usually go through 3 separate transfer points to reach a destination 2 states away. You flagged it internally. Twice. The first time I was told it was a legacy client arrangement handled at the senior level and not something my team needed to track. The second time I put in writing and sent it to my direct supervisor and copied the compliance office. She paused. 2 weeks after the second report, I was called into HR. My position had been eliminated in a restructuring. They offered me a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. Did you sign it? I signed the severance, not the NDA. She looked at him steadily. I knew why they were offering it. Signing it would have told me I was right about everything. Arthur looked back at the wall. After they fired you. I kept going, she said. I had contacts at 2 of the Gulf Coast terminals, people I'd worked with directly who trusted me. Over the next year, I started receiving documents informally. Manifests, transfer logs, partial financial records. Nothing that would hold up in a courtroom on its own, but enough to confirm the pattern. She moved along the wall to a different cluster. Then I found the shell companies. She pointed to a diagram she had drawn by hand, a web of company names connected by arrows, with dollar amounts written beside several of the lines. The names were unfamiliar, registered in places like Delaware and the Cayman Islands, the way corporate shells always were when the point was not to be found. These entities received payment from Callaway Freight accounts through what looked like standard vendor transactions, Naomi said. Equipment leasing, logistics consulting, port facility maintenance. But the vendors don't exist as functioning businesses. They're fronts. The money moves through them and lands in offshore accounts. She tapped one of the lines. I traced 4 of these accounts. 3 of them connect to a single beneficial owner. Arthur already knew what she was going to say. Some part of him had known since the alley. Knowing it was coming didn't make it land any softer. Victor Hale, he said. Yes. The name settled in the room like something dropped from a height. Arthur walked to the window and looked out at the wet street below. A car rolled past slowly. Ordinary. Normal. Nothing about the street suggested that the world had just shifted 2 degrees under his feet. Victor Hale had been with Callaway Freight since the 2nd year. They had met at a shipping industry conference in Houston. Victor, a sharp, restless operations consultant. Arthur, a young company founder trying to figure out how to scale faster than his cash flow allowed. They had worked out of the same 2-room office for 3 years before the company had its first real building. Victor had been at Daniel's funeral. He had held Arthur's shoulder at the graveside and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Arthur had trusted him with things he didn't trust his own lawyers with. How long? Arthur asked. Based on what I can trace, the operation began in a meaningful way about 6 years ago, Naomi said. Small at first. A few shipments a year, low-value cargo, moving through routes that were easy to obscure. But it's grown. The last 18 months, the volume has increased significantly. She hesitated. The weapons components started about 4 years ago. Arthur turned from the window. Say that again. Illegal weapons, Naomi said. Her voice didn't waver. Military-grade equipment, mostly, moving through the freight network, disguised as industrial shipments. Some of it appears to be going to conflict regions. I don't have the full picture on the end buyers, but the scale of what I can document is substantial. She met his eyes. I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to stop it without getting killed. And then you walked into that restaurant tonight. From somewhere on the street outside came the sound of a car slowing near the building. Both of them went still. It passed without stopping. Naomi exhaled slowly. They've been watching the restaurant because someone told them you were making these anonymous walks around the city, she said. They didn't know exactly when you'd show up, but they knew eventually you would. Arthur's jaw tightened. Victor knew about the walks. He's the only person outside your security team who knew your habits that specifically. I found a message thread, encrypted, but my contact was able to get a partial transcript that references a source inside your inner circle. The language used matches the kind of operational detail that only someone very close to you would have. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Victor at the last board meeting 2 weeks ago, leaning back in a chair with the easy confidence of a man who had been in that room so many times it felt like his own furniture. He thought about the way Victor had asked, casually, whether Arthur had been getting enough rest, whether he was taking time away from the office. Victor had been checking his schedule, making sure he was still going on these walks. You said you've been waiting for the right moment to expose this, Arthur said. What was stopping you? Evidence alone isn't enough when the people you're exposing have enough money to bury a case before it reaches a courtroom, Naomi said. I needed someone with the authority to act on it fast enough that it couldn't be buried. Someone the conspirators wouldn't expect. She looked at him without any trace of apology. You're the only person in a position to dismantle this operation before Victor finishes building it into something untouchable. You own the company. You can authorize access to every system, every record. Without you, this stays on my wall for another 3 years. Arthur looked at the wall again. All of it, the maps, the names, the lines of connection, the years of patient and dangerous work that a woman who had been wrongly fired had done in the space between shifts at a steakhouse. Laid out in front of him like a map of a country he thought he knew but had never actually seen. Why didn't you come to me directly? He asked. I tried to reach you through your office twice, Naomi said. Both times I was redirected to Victor Hale's team. She paused. That told me everything I needed to know about who controls your access points. Outside, the rain continued, steady and patient. Arthur turned away from the wall. You're going to need to move all of this, he said. Tonight. Somewhere more secure. Naomi nodded. I know. And tomorrow, Arthur said, we start taking the company back. They spent another hour in Naomi's apartment, going through the documents systematically. Arthur asking questions and Naomi answering them with the precision of someone who had lived inside this information for years. By the time they finished, Arthur had a clear enough picture to know two things with certainty. The operation was real, and it was larger than he wanted to believe. Shortly after midnight, Naomi began packing the most critical documents into a weatherproof case she kept under the bed. Arthur helped her work through the wall, removing pins and stacking papers in the order she specified, respecting the system she had built without asking her to explain it twice. When she sealed the case, she handed it to Arthur. "There's a storage facility on Kedzie," she said. "I rented a unit under a different name 8 months ago. This goes there tonight." "I'll take it," Arthur said. She looked at him for a moment, as if weighing whether that was the right call, then nodded. He could see the years of working alone in that look, the practiced reluctance to hand anything to anyone, even someone who had every reason to be on her side. Arthur called a car service he used personally, one that didn't keep electronic logs. He rode to the storage facility alone, made the transfer, and was back outside within 20 minutes. The rain had thinned to a mist by then. He stood on the street for a moment before getting back in the car. He thought about Daniel. Not the way he usually thought about him, which was in the quiet of the penthouse late at night when the grief came sideways and there was nothing to do but wait for it to pass. He thought about what Daniel would have said about tonight. His son had been idealistic in the way that young people are before the world gives them reasons not to be, but he had also been sharp. He had done an internship at Callaway Freight the summer before he died, and had come home one evening saying he'd noticed some routing anomalies in a Gulf Coast terminal report. Arthur had been in a meeting when Daniel brought it up and had told him it was probably nothing to worry about. That memory arrived now with a weight it had never had before. He got back in the car. The next morning came gray and cold. Arthur arrived at the glass tower headquarters of Callaway Freight Systems just before 8, dressed in a dark suit, his beard trimmed to the precise length that said senior executive rather than man who has been walking the city at night in disguise. The lobby staff greeted him with the particular warmth that employees reserve for a CEO whose appearances have become unpredictable. Genuinely pleased, slightly nervous, recalibrating their morning around his presence. He rode the elevator to the executive floor alone. Victor Hale was already at the building. Arthur knew this without checking because Victor had always arrived before anyone else. It was one of the things Arthur had admired about him for 30 years, the consistency of his discipline, the way he treated being first in as a form of respect for the work. Now Arthur looked at that habit differently. Victor stepped out of his office as Arthur reached the top of the elevator bank. He was 61, lean and well-dressed, with silver hair kept short and a handshake that had never once been anything but firm. He smiled when he saw Arthur, a warm, uncomplicated smile, and extended that hand. "Arthur, this is a surprise." He clasped Arthur's hand in both of his. "It's good to see you in the building." "Good to be back," Arthur said, and smiled in return, matching warmth for warmth. He had spent 30 years learning Victor's tells. He now spent these 10 seconds looking for them. Victor's eyes were direct. His posture was easy. His voice held nothing that sounded like a man who had sent 2 people to watch his business partner the night before. That, Arthur thought, was genuinely impressive. "I've been letting things get away from me," Arthur said, falling in a step beside Victor toward the executive conference room. "I think it's time I'm more present." "Couldn't agree more," Victor said. "The team will be glad to hear it. There are a few things I'd like to walk you through this week when you have time. Some international contract renewals, the Q4 projections." "Of course," Arthur said. "We'll find time." They parted ways at the conference room door, Victor continuing down the hall toward his own office. Arthur watched him go for a half second. This man he had known for 3 decades, whose children he had attended birthday parties for, whose wife had sent Arthur a handwritten note when Daniel died, and then walked into the conference room and began his day. 2 floors below, Naomi Carter arrived at the building at 9, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the kind of composed, professional expression that said she had been in offices like this before and wasn't impressed by the height of the ceilings. The temporary consulting badge Arthur had arranged the previous evening was waiting at the security desk. She clipped it to her jacket took the elevator to the 8th floor, and found the workstation that had been assigned to her. She sat down, logged in with the credentials Arthur had authorized, and opened the logistics database without drawing attention to herself. Around her, the open-plan office hummed with the ordinary noise of a large company moving through its morning. Nobody looked twice at a new consultant. Naomi began pulling records. She started with the Gulf Coast terminals, the same routes she had flagged 3 years ago, before any of this had consequences. She expected to find what she had found before, perhaps expanded. What she found instead was something that made her set her coffee cup down and lean closer to the screen. The operation had grown to a scale that her 3 years of external research had only partially mapped. Entire freight corridors had been quietly restructured. Routing codes she had never seen before appeared throughout the shipping database, tied to client designations that existed nowhere in the active contract registry. When she cross-referenced the cargo weights against the vessel manifests, the discrepancies were significant enough that any competent auditor should have caught them years ago, which told her that the auditors had either been compromised or replaced. By late afternoon, she had filled a secure, encrypted drive with copied records. She had also found something new, a shipment scheduled to depart within the week from the port of Chicago, routed through 3 transfer points before heading overseas. The cargo designation read industrial components. The weight was wrong by nearly 12 tons. She flagged it in her personal notes and logged out for the day. On her way out of the building, she passed through the lobby without incident. But as the revolving door deposited her onto the sidewalk and she turned toward the train station, she saw a parked car across the street. Dark sedan, engine running, 2 figures visible through the windshield. The same 2 men from the restaurant. Naomi kept walking. She didn't change her pace or look back. She turned the first corner she reached and pulled out her phone to call Arthur. Arthur took the call in his private office with the door closed. He listened without interrupting while Naomi described what she had found in the database and then described the car outside. "You're certain it was the same men?" he said. "I'm certain," she said. "Where are you now?" 3 blocks from the building. "I'm still walking." "Keep moving. Take the blue line from Clark and Lake, not the stop nearest the office. Don't go back to your apartment tonight." A pause. "My apartment." "I know," he said. "I'll arrange somewhere secure for you to stay. Give me an hour." He ended the call and sat for a moment at his desk, looking at nothing in particular. Then he picked up his desk phone and called the building's head of maintenance, asking without any special urgency whether the office systems had received any updates to their audit logging protocols in the last 6 months. The answer told him what Naomi's discovery had already suggested. Several logging parameters had been quietly disabled 14 months ago, following what was documented as a routine systems upgrade. The audit trail for the suspicious shipping routes had been deliberately obscured. Someone with deep access to the company's internal systems had made sure the records were hard to follow. Arthur thought about Victor's office 3 floors above him and the 30 years of trust that had apparently been running on a clock whose alarm he had never heard set. He also thought about Naomi's apartment and the 3 years of evidence pinned to its walls. The work of a woman who had been fired, blacklisted, and never once stopped. He had moved the critical documents to the storage unit. But the apartment itself, the physical space that anyone watching Naomi would have known about, had been a vulnerability neither of them had addressed last night. He picked up his phone and called his building manager. Then he called a private car service. Then he opened his laptop and began a secure email to a federal prosecutor named James Whitfield, a man who had helped Callaway Freight navigate a regulatory dispute 8 years ago and who Arthur trusted precisely because he had never asked for anything in return. The email was short. It said he needed a private conversation as soon as possible and that it involved a matter of significant national concern. He hit send and closed the laptop. 20 minutes later, his cell phone rang. It was Naomi. Her voice was quieter than it had been on the previous call. Control, but only just. "My apartment," she said. "Tell me." "I went back for a coat. I know you said not to, but I went back." A breath. "Someone got there first. The whole room. They went through everything." Arthur closed his eyes for a single second. "Are you inside the building?" he said. "I'm on the street. I looked through the window. I didn't go in." "Good. Stay exactly where you are. Don't move." He was already standing, reaching for his jacket with one hand. "I'm sending a car right now." "The wall," Naomi said, and for the first time since he had met her, something in her voice broke open slightly. "Everything I had on the wall." "It doesn't matter," Arthur said. "We moved the documents. The important things are safe." He paused. "Are you safe right now? Right this moment?" "Yes." "Then that's all that matters. The car will be there in 8 minutes. Get in it." He hung up and stood still in his office for one breath. Then the stillness ended. The part of Arthur that had spent 30 years solving impossible problems from positions of disadvantage came forward with the quiet, absolute clarity of something that had been waiting to be needed. Victor Hale believed that he had broken the only evidence trail and frightened the only witness. He believed he was ahead. He believed Arthur didn't know. All three of those beliefs were wrong. Arthur walked to his window and looked out over the city, the same city he had walked through last night in a worn coat, looking for something he had lost. He had found it, though not the way he expected. He thought about what he had said to Daniel on that last phone call, the one from Tokyo before the flight home. He had said he would make it right. He always made things right. He pulled out his phone and sent a single message to Naomi. "The car is coming. You did 3 years of work that no one else would have done. Now we finish it together." Then he set the phone down on the desk and began building his next move. The safe house Arthur arranged for Naomi turned out to be a corporate apartment on the 14th floor of a building his company leased for visiting executives. It was clean, anonymous, and had a deadbolt that responded to a key card only Arthur controlled. When Naomi arrived that evening, still wearing her office clothes and carrying nothing but the satchel she had taken to work that morning, she stood in the center of the living room for a long moment and looked at the plain walls and the plain furniture and the window that showed nothing but other buildings. "This'll do," she said, and sat down at the small kitchen table with her encrypted drive and her laptop and got back to work. Arthur arrived an hour later with food from a place around the corner and the news that James Whitfield had called back. "He wants a meeting," Arthur said, setting the containers on the table. "Day after tomorrow. Private." Naomi looked up. "Does he know what it's about?" "He knows it's serious." That was enough for James. Arthur sat across from her. "He's one of the few people in this city who I'm certain Victor has never gotten to. They've never been in the same room if I can help it." Naomi nodded slowly. She pushed the laptop aside and looked at Arthur with the direct steadiness he had come to recognize as her version of raising something important. "Going back to the office," she said. "You understand that if Victor has people watching the building's access logs, my credentials showing up inside the company database will eventually raise a question." "I've thought about that," Arthur said. "Your access is routed through a consulting firm account that doesn't connect to your name directly. It'll hold for 2 weeks, maybe 3. We don't need longer than that. You're more confident about the timeline than I am." "I'm confident about what we have," Arthur said, "and what we don't have yet. We need the shipment." He looked at her. "The one you flagged. If we can document that departure, cargo loaded, manifest filed, vessels moving, and connect that directly to Victor's authorization, it becomes the kind of evidence that doesn't get buried. Not even with money." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Outside, a siren passed on the street below and faded west. "If we move too early," she said, "he runs. He's already been moving money. If he senses the walls closing in before we're ready, he disappears and the company takes the fall." "I know," Arthur said, "which is why we don't move until the shipment is loaded and the federal team is in position." He met her eyes. "We play this like we don't know anything. We let him think he's still ahead." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and opened her laptop again. The next morning, Arthur returned to the executive floor of Callaway Freight as though the previous 48 hours had been nothing more than a quiet Tuesday, followed by a quiet Wednesday. He attended the 9 o'clock operations briefing, asked 3 detailed questions about the Q4 freight projections, and approved 2 contract renewals that had been sitting on his desk for weeks. He was the picture of a CEO who had shaken off his recent absence and come back ready to work. At 11, he called Victor into his office for what he framed as a routine conversation about international contracts. Victor arrived with a leather folder and a relaxed expression, settling into the chair across from Arthur's desk with the ease of a man who had sat in that chair hundreds of times. I've been thinking about running a thorough internal audit, Arthur said, watching Victor's face. A few of the shipping divisions, Gulf Coast terminals especially. I want fresh eyes on the routing efficiency. Victor's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted behind it. A very small recalibration, like a slight adjustment in weight from one foot to the other. His voice when he responded was smooth and measured. That makes sense from a general oversight perspective, Victor said. I just flagged that we have a few international contracts currently in sensitive renewal phases. A formal audit announcement could read as instability to some of those partners. He tilted his head. Worth thinking about the timing. Noted, Arthur said. He smiled easily. I'll keep that in mind. Victor left the office looking, to anyone watching, like a man who had just had an entirely ordinary conversation. But Arthur had sat across from Victor Hale in negotiations, in board disputes, in moments of genuine crisis, for 3 decades. He knew the difference between Victor's resting composure and the slightly flattened version of it that appeared when something had landed that Victor needed a moment to process. The audit suggestion had landed. Arthur gave it an hour, then called Naomi from his private cell. He pushed back on the audit, Arthur said, politely, framed it as a concern about optics with international partners. Did he ask which divisions? Naomi said. He didn't need to. He already knew. Arthur looked out his office window at the gray November sky. He's going to move the shipment up. I'd bet on it. Then we need Whitfield faster than day after tomorrow. I'm calling him after this. 2 floors below, Naomi was working through the company's vessel scheduling database when she found the confirmation. The departure date for the flag shipment had been quietly moved up by 36 hours. The change had been logged under a routine scheduling adjustment authorized by a mid-level operations manager whose name Naomi recognized from Victor's organizational layer. She screenshotted the record, copied the authorization trail, and added it to the encrypted drive. Then she pulled the full manifest for the shipment. What she found made her sit back in her chair. She had estimated the shipment at hundreds of millions. The actual figure, when she traced the full cargo load and cross-referenced the weapons classifications against current market valuations for the equipment types listed, was closer to $400 million. The weapons were distributed across 11 cargo containers, each disguised under separate industrial designations, each cleared through a different customs broker, all of them connected to the same shell company network she had mapped on her apartment wall. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she closed the database, encrypted the drive, tucked it into the inner pocket of her jacket, and went to the restroom. She stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrist the way she had learned to do when the scale of something threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly. She looked at herself in the mirror. 3 years. She had spent 3 years building toward this moment from a 1-bedroom apartment with a wall covered in papers that anyone who saw it probably thought belonged to someone who had come unhinged. She had done it alone, on a waitress's salary, after a company with enormous resources had decided she was a problem to be eliminated rather than a person who deserved an answer. She dried her hands and went back to her workstation. That evening, Naomi was walking to the elevator when she noticed a man near the lobby security desk. He was standing with his back partially turned, studying his phone, wearing a dark coat that would have been unremarkable except that she had seen it before outside the building yesterday, on one of the 2 men from the restaurant. She kept her pace steady and took the elevator down, stepping out into the lobby and walking directly to the revolving door without looking at him. The cold air hit her as she came out onto the street. She turned left and walked 2 blocks before crossing and doubling back on the opposite side, taking a route she had planned mentally on her second day at the building as a precaution she hoped not to need. No one followed. She called Arthur from a coffee shop 3 blocks from the train station. The same man from the restaurant, she said. Inside the building lobby. He wasn't there as a visitor. He didn't check in at security. He was already inside. Arthur's voice was quiet and controlled. He has someone with building access vouching for him. That's what I think. A pause. Are you clear now? I'm clear. Go straight to the apartment. I'll be there in an hour. Another pause. Naomi, you did the right thing not reacting. She ended the call and sat with her coffee for a few minutes, watching the street through the window. The city moved past in its ordinary evening rhythm. People heading home, cabs cutting across lanes, a delivery truck idling at a corner. None of it was aware of the thing moving inside it. She finished the coffee and went to the apartment. When Arthur arrived that evening, he brought James Whitfield with him. Whitfield was 63, compact and gray-haired, with the kind of face that had spent decades hearing things people didn't want to say in court and had developed an expression of permanent, patient attention as a result. He shook Naomi's hand when Arthur introduced them and looked at her the way experienced prosecutors look at people they're meeting for the first time, without judgment but with complete alertness. They sat at the kitchen table. Naomi walked Whitfield through the evidence in order, starting with the original flag shipments from 3 years ago and moving forward through every document she had gathered since. Whitfield asked questions that were short and precise and always aimed at the exact point where the chain of evidence had a gap. Naomi answered each one directly, acknowledging the gaps and explaining what she had and hadn't been able to document independently. An hour in, Whitfield sat back and looked at Arthur. "This is real," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's real," Arthur said. "The shipment departure in 72 hours. You're certain about the timeline?" "The scheduling change was made today," Naomi said. "I have the authorization trail." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "I can have a federal team in position. Port Authority cooperation, customs, a judge I trust who will move fast on a warrant." He looked at Arthur. "But once this starts, it can't stop. If we move and the shipment turns out to be clean, the reputational damage to the company will be significant." "The shipment isn't clean," Arthur said. "No," Whitfield said. "I don't believe it is." He looked at the drive on the table. "I'm going to need copies of everything on that." The 72 hours between Whitfield's visit and the shipment's scheduled departure moved with a strange double quality. Slow in the waiting, fast in everything that was happening inside the waiting. Arthur arrived at the office each morning as though the most pressing items on his agenda were contract renewals and quarterly projections. He sat through 2 board meetings and a client lunch and a presentation from the marketing division about a rebranding initiative he had approved the previous year and now had to pretend to be interested in. He asked the right questions and signed the right documents and smiled at the right moments. And every time he passed Victor in the executive corridor, he met the man's eyes with the same warm steadiness he had always shown there, 30 years running. Victor, for his part, appeared calm. That was the thing that Arthur kept coming back to in the quiet of his office with the door closed. Victor appeared calm. He had always been calm. It was the quality that had made him so effective in negotiations and so dangerous, as it turned out, as an adversary. Arthur had once thought of Victor's composure as a professional virtue. Now he understood it differently. It was the composure of a man who had been planning an exit for years and believed the exit was still on schedule. Meanwhile, Naomi worked. She arrived each morning and sat at her workstation and pulled records with the focused efficiency of someone on a deadline they didn't intend to miss. Within the first 2 days, she had added 14 new documents to the evidence package Whitfield was building. Additional authorization trails, a partial record of the encrypted communication channels Victor's team had been using to coordinate the shipment, and a financial transfer dated 3 days earlier that showed Victor moving a significant sum into a private account in a jurisdiction that didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. That last item was the one that changed the pace. Naomi forwarded it to Arthur with a single line. "He's getting ready to run." Arthur read it at his desk and forwarded it immediately to Whitfield. Whitfield's response arrived within the hour. "We're moving the timeline up. Federal team briefed. Warrant in progress. Need you and Naomi in a secure location by tomorrow evening." On the second day, Naomi was in the middle of downloading a final batch of vessel departure authorizations when the database session timed out in an unusual way. Not the standard logout prompt, but a sudden disconnection that left no error message. She tried logging back in. The credentials failed. Her access had been revoked. She sat very still at her workstation for a moment. Then she looked up casually, the way a person does when a computer does something minor and annoying, and scanned the open plan office around her. Across the floor, near the door to the operations corridor, A man she didn't recognize was speaking quietly with the department supervisor. The supervisor glanced in Naomi's direction once, briefly. Naomi picked up her satchel, stood up, and walked to the kitchen area as though she was getting coffee. She went through the kitchen, found the door to the stairwell, and took it down to the lobby without going back to her workstation. She was on the street in under 4 minutes. She called Arthur before she reached the corner. "They pulled my access," she said. "Someone flagged the consulting account." Arthur's voice was measured. "Are you out of the building?" "I'm on the street." "Get to the apartment. Don't stop anywhere." "Arthur." She kept her voice steady. "I got almost everything. There's one more transfer record I didn't finish downloading, but I got the departure authorizations and the full cargo manifest for all 11 containers." She paused. "It's enough." A brief silence. "It's more than enough," he said. "Get to the apartment. I'll meet you there." She ended the call and kept walking. 3 floors above, in the executive corridor, Victor Hale stood at his office window with his phone pressed to his ear. His posture was the same as it always was, straight, composed, unhurried. But the conversation he was having was quiet enough that even someone standing in the doorway wouldn't have caught the words. "She's out of the building," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Handle the shipment. Move everything to the secondary loading schedule. Tonight, not tomorrow." Another pause. His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm aware of what Arthur is doing. Let me manage that end." He ended the call and stood looking at the city for a moment. Then he walked down the corridor to Arthur's office and knocked. Arthur looked up from his desk. "Victor, I just wanted to check in," Victor said, leaning in the doorway with easy familiarity. "I've been hearing some odd things about system access issues in the operations department. Thought you should know." "What kind of issues?" Arthur said. "A consulting account that appears to have been accessing freight databases outside the scope of its assigned project." Victor's eyes were direct. "Steady. I flag it to IT. Just making sure you were in the loop." "I appreciate that," Arthur said. "I'll look into it." Victor studied him for exactly 1 second longer than the sentence required. Then he smiled. "Good. Let me know if you need anything." He turned and walked back down the corridor. Arthur waited until the footsteps had faded. Then he picked up his phone and sent Whitfield a single message. He knows something is wrong. Whatever the timeline is, it just got shorter. Whitfield's response came 40 minutes later with a time and a location. A federal building on the south side, a conference room on the 4th floor, 7 o'clock that evening. Arthur left the office at 5:30, telling his assistant he had a private dinner. He took a car service with a driver who had worked for him personally for 11 years and who understood, without being told, that the evening's route was not to be logged. Naomi was already at the federal building when Arthur arrived. She looked steady, though Arthur noticed she had set her coffee down and wasn't touching it. A small tell that the afternoon had cost her more than her voice suggested. Whitfield had 4 people with him: 2 federal agents, an attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and a customs official who handled Port Authority coordination. They sat around the conference table and went through the evidence in full. The agents asked detailed questions about the cargo manifest. The customs official confirmed that the vessel departure schedule matched what Naomi had downloaded. The attorney reviewed the authorization chains, linking the shell companies to Victor's accounts. At the end of it, Whitfield looked at the group and then at Arthur. "We have enough for the warrant," he said. "The plan is to allow the loading to complete. We want everything in those containers documented and photographed before we move. Once the cargo is fully loaded and the departure order is filed, we execute." He looked at Arthur. "You'll need to be at the harbor." "I know," Arthur said. "Victor may be there personally," one of the agents said. "Based on the scale of this operation, it's likely he wants to oversee the final departure himself." "He'll be there," Arthur said. "There will be armed security around those vessels," the agent continued. "These aren't ordinary dock workers. Some of the men Victor has contracted are professionals. This will not be a simple arrest situation." The room was quiet for a moment. "Which is why we bring enough people that it doesn't need to be complicated," Whitfield said. He looked at Naomi. "You've been inside those databases for 2 days. Is there anything on that manifest, anything at all, that tells you those containers have legitimate contents?" Naomi met his eyes. "No," she said. Whitfield nodded. "Then we move tomorrow night." Arthur drove Naomi back to the safe house apartment himself. They rode, mostly in silence, the city lights reflecting off the rain-wet streets outside the windows. Arthur kept his hand steady on the wheel and his eyes forward, but somewhere in the last mile before the building he spoke. "When this is over," he said, "I want to talk about what comes next. For you. Not as a thanks, just as something that's overdue." Naomi looked at the road ahead. "Let's get through tomorrow night first." "Fair enough." He pulled up outside the building, and she got out. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "The cybersecurity man you brought in," she said. "The one who died." Arthur's expression didn't shift, but something in him went very still. "His name was Robert Greer," Arthur said. "He was 51. He had a daughter in college." Naomi held his eyes. "Then we do this right," she said. "All the way through." She went inside. Arthur sat in the parked car for a long moment, the engine idling, the rain tapping steadily against the roof. He thought about Robert Greer, and about Daniel, and about the strange path that had led him from a penthouse he no longer felt at home in, through a rainy alley behind a steakhouse, to a parked car outside a safe house, where a woman who had been waiting 3 years for this moment was getting ready for the night that mattered. He thought about what Victor had said at Daniel's graveside. He was a good kid, Arthur. He saw things clearly. He had seen things clearly from the very beginning. Arthur put the car in drive and headed back toward the city. Tomorrow night it would end. The harbor at night was a different world from the city that surrounded it. The towers of glass and light that defined Chicago's skyline existed at a distance here, their reflections broken and scattered across the black water. At the docks, everything was steel and concrete, and the low mechanical groan of cranes that never fully slept. The smell was diesel and salt and cold iron. Floodlights mounted on tall poles threw hard white circles across the loading yards, leaving everything between them in deep shadow. Arthur arrived at the federal staging point just before 10. It was a warehouse 2 blocks from the main cargo terminal, unmarked from the outside, and inside it held more federal personnel than Arthur had expected. 24 agents in various levels of gear, a communications team with equipment spread across folding tables, a representative from the Port Authority, and Whitfield standing near a large printed map of the terminal layout with a cup of coffee he appeared to have forgotten about. Whitfield looked up when Arthur came in. "Any problems getting here?" "None," Arthur said. "Victor left the office at 6. I had someone watching the building." Arthur kept his coat on and looked at the map. "Has the loading started?" 2 hours ago, one of the agents said, stepping forward. His name was Dawson. The lead agent, mid-40s, the kind of stillness about him that came from having done this kind of thing enough times to stop treating it like an event. "All 11 containers are at the dock. 6 are already loaded onto the primary vessel. The other 5 are in the final staging area." He pointed at the map. "We let the loading complete. Once the departure order is filed with Port Authority, which will see the moment it's submitted, we move." "Where's Naomi?" Arthur said. "She went in 90 minutes ago," Dawson said. "Logistics inspector credentials. She's already inside the terminal." Arthur looked at Whitfield. "Her call," Whitfield said. "She insisted on being there to confirm the containers. She knows those manifests better than anyone in this room." Arthur said nothing. He had expected as much. He looked back at the map and traced the layout of the terminal with his eyes. The loading berths, the staging areas, the access roads, and a secondary lot near the eastern edge of the yard where the map showed a helipad used for Port Authority operations. "The helicopter," Arthur said. Dawson followed his gaze. "We got eyes on it. If anyone tries to use it tonight, they won't get far." Arthur nodded slowly. He thought about Victor, the way the man moved through rooms, the way he thought 3 steps ahead in negotiations, the way he had spent 30 years learning everything Arthur knew about how to stay calm under pressure and use that calm as a weapon. "Don't underestimate the people he's hired," Arthur said. "Victor doesn't cut corners on things that matter to him." "We're not cutting corners either," Dawson said. Inside, the terminal Naomi moved carefully between the massive steel containers, her clipboard held in front of her and a hard hat on her head that she had picked up from the inspector station at the main gate. The credentials Whitfield's team had arranged were solid enough to pass a casual check, and the dock workers were too focused on the loading operation to pay much attention to a single inspector moving through the staging area. The containers were enormous up close, 12 meters long, stacked too high in the staging area. Their surfaces marked with the standard shipping code she had memorized from the manifests. She worked her way along the row, checking the identification numbers against the list on her clipboard and confirming the seals. Everything on the outside matched what was documented. That was the point. The deception was designed to survive exactly this kind of surface-level inspection. But Naomi wasn't doing a surface-level inspection. On her third pass through the staging area, she paused at a container near the far end of the row. The seal number matched the manifest. The container code matched, but the weight distribution was wrong. She could see it in the way the container sat on its chassis, the slight forward lean that indicated a load heavier at one end than its documentation described. She had learned to read that lean from 2 years of logistics work. Industrial components didn't load that way. Weapons crated in military packaging did. She marked the container number on her clipboard and kept moving. She had confirmed 9 of the 11 when she heard the helicopter. It wasn't starting up. It was already running a low rhythmic beat coming from the eastern end of the yard. She stopped and looked in that direction. The floodlights didn't reach that far. She could see the blinking position lights of the aircraft above the roofline of a low equipment shed. Then she heard the voice. It was coming from the other side of the nearest container stack, low and deliberate, carrying in the cold air more clearly than the speaker probably intended. She recognized it immediately. Victor Hade. She moved to the edge of the container and looked around it carefully. Victor was standing 20 meters away in the shadow of a crane arm, speaking with 2 men in dark clothing whose posture said they were not dock workers and not inspectors. He was wearing a heavy coat and no tie, not the executive she had watched operate in boardrooms, but a man who had come to finish something and had dressed for it accordingly. The last 5 containers go on within the hour, Victor was saying. His voice was controlled. Once the departure order is filed, we're done here. Everything after that moves without me. A pause. And the other matter? One of the men said something Naomi couldn't catch. Make sure of it, Victor said. Arthur needs to be managed before morning. Quietly, Naomi's grip tightened on the clipboard. She pulled back behind the container and stood with her back flat against the cold steel, breathing steadily. Managed before morning. The phrase had the sound of something said by a man who had already decided and was now giving instructions, not making a suggestion. She reached in her jacket for her phone to call Arthur. A hand closed around her arm from behind. She reacted immediately, turning, pulling away, but the grip was strong and she was spun against the container before she could get clear. One of the armed guards, not the 2 with Victor, but a third she hadn't seen, held her by both arms and looked at her without any expression at all. Clipboard, he said. Naomi held it. He pulled it from her hands and looked at the list. Then he looked at her hard hat, her jacket, the credentials clipped to her pocket. His eyes moved to her face with the flat assessment of someone checking whether a problem was small or large. Walk, he said. He walked her around the end of the container row. Victor saw them coming from 20 meters away and went very still for a moment. The stillness of a man recalculating, and then his face settled into the composed expression that Naomi had seen described in court documents and company profiles and had now seen in person twice in the space of 2 days. He looked at her for a long moment. Miss Carter, he said. His voice was almost gentle. I hoped I wouldn't see you again. I thought about being somewhere else tonight, Naomi said, but I'd spent too long working toward this to miss it. Victor studied her with something that might, in a different context, have been respect. You've been remarkably persistent, he said. I'll give you that. 3 years is a long time to hold on to something. He tilted his head slightly. Who else is here tonight? Naomi said nothing. Victor nodded slowly, as if she'd answered anyway. He turned to the guard. Take her inside and let her go. The voice came from the left. Everyone turned. Arthur Calloway stepped out of the shadow between 2 container stacks, walking with the even, unhurried pace of a man who had decided exactly how this moment would go before arriving at it. He was alone, or appeared to be, and the guard with Naomi looked between Arthur and Victor with a rapid assessment of someone trying to determine who gave orders here. Arthur, Victor said. Something moved briefly across his face. Then it was gone. I wonder when you'd show up. You've been wondering for a few days now, Arthur said. He stopped 10 meters from Victor and looked at him directly. No warmth in it. No anger either. Just the clear, patient attention of a man who had decided to see something fully before acting on it. Since I mentioned the audit, since before that, Victor said, you've been different since you came back to the office. Quieter than usual, watching things you normally let me handle. He looked at Naomi briefly, and then her. He paused. How long have you known? Long enough, Arthur said, but I wanted to hear you say it. A long silence. The crane above them groaned with the weight of a container moving along its track toward the vessel. Somewhere across the yard a radio crackled and went quiet. You were supposed to slow down, Victor said finally. His voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had changed, a bitterness surfacing that had clearly been building for a long time. After Daniel died, you were supposed to step back, let the company run the way it needed to run. He looked at Arthur with eyes that were steady and cold. Instead, you held on, and the company held on with you, and it started to suffocate under the weight of everything you were trying to keep it loyal to. Some of us saw what it could become if someone made the hard decisions you wouldn't. Arthur was quiet for a moment. And the weapons? The trafficking? Those were the hard decisions. That was the operational reality of working at the scale we reached, Victor said flatly. Global freight, at that level, touches things that aren't clean. I made the company competitive in a market you refused to fully engage with. I made it worth something. You made it criminal, Arthur said. I made it survive. The words sat in the cold air between them. Behind Victor, one of the two original armed men had his hand moving toward his jacket. In the shadows between the containers, to Arthur's left, two federal agents were positioned and waiting. Dawson's voice had told Arthur clearly before he walked in. The moment Victor moves toward the helicopter, we move. Don't let him get to the helicopter. Victor's eyes flicked left, past Arthur, reading the dark spaces between the containers. A calculation moved behind his face. You brought people, he said. I did. Victor looked at him for one more second. Then he turned and walked fast toward the eastern end of the yard. Federal agents, move now. Dawson's voice cut through the night from two directions at once. The yard erupted. Floodlights that had been dark came on from the staging area perimeter. Vehicles that had been parked along the access road activated their lights and moved. The armed guards with Victor drew weapons, and Naomi dropped flat against the base of the nearest container as the sound of shouting and running feet filled the space between the steel walls. The guard who had been holding Naomi had released her when Arthur appeared and was now moving toward the water side of the dock. Two agents cut him off before he reached the ramp. Victor was fast. He had 30 years less age on Arthur, and he moved through the yard with the direction of a man who had planned this route. He cleared the equipment shed and came out on the far side of it with the helicopter 20 meters ahead, its blades already turning. Arthur had gone around the shed on the other side. They came face to face for the second time in 60 seconds, this time with nothing between them and the helicopter sitting behind Victor like the answer to a question he hadn't finished asking. Arthur was breathing hard. Victor was breathing harder. The rotor wash flattened both their coats against their bodies and made conversation something that had to be said directly, not around. It's over, Victor, Arthur said. Victor looked at the helicopter, looked at Arthur. Something moved through his face that was harder to name than anger or calculation. Something older, something that looked almost like grief, though whether it was for the company or the friendship or himself was impossible to say. I built that company too, Victor said. I know, Arthur said. The federal agents came around both sides of the shed. Dawson was among them, his badge held out, his voice steady and clear as he identified himself and told Victor to put his hands where they could be seen. Victor stood very still for a moment. Then his shoulders dropped by about half an inch, a small movement, almost nothing, and he put his hands up. Dawson's team moved in quickly and efficiently. Handcuffs, a recitation of rights. The helicopter pilot, who had clearly been hired for this night specifically, was removed from the aircraft by two agents who had approached from the waterside, while Victor was focused on Arthur. Across the yard, the other guards were being secured. The 5 remaining containers sat in the staging area under floodlights. their false manifests meaning nothing now. Arthur stood and watched Victor Hale be led away across the yard, and he felt almost none of the things he had expected to feel. What he felt instead was tired. The deep, settling tiredness that comes not from a single long night, but from a long time of not knowing the full shape of something and finally knowing it. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. Naomi walked up beside him, her hard hat gone, a small scrape on her left palm from hitting the ground that she was pressing absently with her other hand. She stopped next to Arthur and looked across the yard at the federal vehicles and the lights and the operation that was now in its final stages. 9 confirmed out of 11 containers, she said. I got the ID numbers. Good, Arthur said. They stood there for a moment in the cold. Over the water, the first pale suggestion of morning was beginning to separate the sky from the lake, gray easing into the black in a way that wasn't yet light, but was the memory of it. He said he built the company too, Naomi said. He did, Arthur said. That part was true. Does that make it harder? Arthur was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. That's exactly what makes it harder. The sun continued its slow return. Around them the harbor resumed its mechanical rhythm. Cranes, water, steel, as though it had merely paused for an interruption and now had freight to move. 6 months passed the way months do after something large has ended. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the gradual accumulation of smaller things that slowly replaced the space the large thing had occupied. The investigation that followed the harbor operation became one of the most significant corporate crime cases the country had seen in a decade. The 11 cargo containers yielded evidence that extended far beyond what even Naomi's 3 years of research had fully mapped, connecting Victor's network to buyers in 3 countries and implicating 6 additional executives at Callaway Freight, along with 2 outside logistics firms that had been providing cover for the shell company transfers. The financial forensics team working with Whitfield's office spent 4 months tracing the money and found that Victor had moved just over $300 million through the offshore accounts over 6 years. Victor Hale and his co-conspirators faced charges that included arms trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, and in Robert Greer's case, a charge that Whitfield pursued with particular focus. Victor's attorneys were expensive and thorough. The case was not simple, but Naomi's documentation, the 3 years of manifests, transfer records, and financial trail she had assembled in a 1-bedroom apartment on a waitress's salary, formed the backbone of the prosecution's evidence in a way that the lead attorney described to the press as having rare depth and precision. Arthur said nothing to the press about Naomi's role. He had asked her first whether she wanted to be named, and she had said she wanted to think about it. She thought about it for a week and then said yes, because the people who had fired her and blacklisted her and broken into her apartment deserved to know that the thing they had tried to stop had stopped them instead. At Callaway Freight, the restructuring was significant. 3 board members resigned. 2 senior vice presidents were placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's findings. The company's stock dropped sharply in the week following the harbor operation and then began a slow, steady recovery as Arthur appeared in front of shareholders and analysts and employees and said the same thing in different ways. The company's foundation was sound, its legitimate operations were intact, and the people responsible for the criminal network had been removed from every level of the organization. He said it calmly and consistently. And people believed him because people who had watched Arthur Callaway build something from nothing over 30 years recognized what he looked like when he was telling the truth. 8 months after the night at the restaurant, Arthur drove himself to Benson's Steakhouse on Weston Avenue. He parked his own car, walked to the front door, and pushed it open. He was wearing a dark jacket and no disguise, and he had told his security lead exactly where he was going and when he expected to be back. The evening felt different from the outside than it had on the night he first walked in. The cracked window had been replaced at some point, and the flickering letter on the sign above the door had been fixed. Small things. The kind of things that get addressed when someone starts paying attention again. Inside the restaurant, the host looked up and recognized him immediately. Not as the ragged man who had come in 8 months ago, but as the man whose face had been on the front page of 3 national publications in the past 6 months. The host's expression went through several adjustments in quick succession before settling on something professionally welcoming. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "do you have a reservation?" "I do," Arthur said. "Table for two." He was shown to a table near the center of the room. Not the same table as before, but close. The restaurant was busier than it had been on that Tuesday night in the rain. The dining room had a different feeling to it as well, something lighter and less tense, and it took Arthur a moment to realize it was because Harold Denton was no longer managing the floor. Denton had been questioned by federal investigators 3 months ago and had quietly resigned from the restaurant shortly after. The investigation into his specific role was ongoing. Arthur sat down and looked around the room for a moment. The corner table was occupied by a family with 2 young children, ordinary and completely unaware of what that table had meant 8 months ago. Naomi arrived 7 minutes later. She was dressed differently from the last time he had seen her in this room. No server apron, no notepad, no professional neutrality deployed as a defensive posture. She was wearing a dark blazer and carrying a bag over one shoulder, and she walked through the dining room with the straightforward ease of a person who had decided she was done making herself smaller in rooms that hadn't earned her discomfort. She sat down across from Arthur. The same host who had greeted Arthur arrived immediately with menus. Naomi took hers without looking at it. "You're going to order the ribeye," she said. "I was considering it," Arthur said. "It's still the best thing they make." She set the menu down. "I would know." They ordered. The food came. They talked about the case, about the restructuring, about 2 of the resigned board members who had quietly attempted to negotiate reduced cooperation agreements with the prosecution and had been turned down. They talked about Robert Greer's daughter, who Arthur had reached out to personally and for whom he had arranged a full scholarship to complete the degree she had been working toward when her father died. Naomi listened to that without speaking, and Arthur saw in her expression the same thing he had seen on the harbor that morning 6 months ago. Not just the relief of something being done right, but the quiet grief of knowing how long it had taken to get there. After a while, the table was cleared, and they sat with coffee, and the restaurant moved around them in its ordinary evening rhythm. Arthur set his cup down. "I have to ask you something," he said. "It's been bothering me since the beginning." Naomi looked at him with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth that suggested she knew what was coming. "How did you know it was me that night?" Arthur said. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was deciding whether to answer, he understood, but because she was deciding where to start. "When I first joined the company as an analyst," she said, "I did what I always did when I started somewhere new. I learned everything I could about the leadership, not because I was told to, just because understanding who ran an organization helped me understand how the organization actually worked underneath the official version of itself." She looked at him steadily. "I read everything public about you. Interviews, profiles, the early history of the company. I watched 2 long-form documentary segments about Callaway Freight. And in one of them, there was footage of you walking through a warehouse facility in Memphis. Early 90s, the company was still small, and you walked through that warehouse the same way you walked into this restaurant 8 months ago. Head up, shoulders back, taking in every corner of the room before you'd stopped moving." Arthur was quiet. "The coat was old, and the boots were worn, and the beard was convincing," Naomi said. "But the posture was 30 years of knowing you own every room you walk into. You can change your clothes. You can't change that." "The watch," Arthur said. "The watch confirmed it. But I knew before the watch." Arthur nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee cup, and the real reason for the note. "He said it wasn't about recognizing me." "It wasn't," Naomi said. "Earlier that same evening, one of the 2 men from the corner table had been near the service station when I was refilling a condiment tray. He was on his phone, and he was describing someone, height, age, build, the kind of coat. It matched you exactly." He said the name Callaway. She paused. "I knew by then you were already in the building, and I knew those 2 men had been using the restaurant to watch for someone. When I put those things together, the note wasn't a plan. It was a decision I made in about 15 seconds. If you hadn't made it," Arthur said, "you'd have finished your steak," Naomi said, "and then something would have happened in the parking lot, or on the street, or somewhere between the restaurant and wherever you were going." She said it without drama, the way she said most things, as a fact that deserved to be acknowledged and then moved past. "Victor's people weren't there to talk to you." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. There was a quality to the silence between them that had been present since that hallway behind the kitchen 8 months ago. A steadiness, a mutual recognition that something real had passed between them and didn't need to be described to exist. "I'm going to make you an offer," Arthur said, "and I want you to hear the whole thing before you respond." Naomi folded her hands on the table and waited. "I've created a new division within Callaway Freight," Arthur said. "Internal investigations and compliance. Its mandate is to ensure that what Victor built inside the company can never be built again, anywhere in the organization, at any level. It has full access to every system, reports directly to me and to the board, and operates independently of every other executive function." He paused. "I want you to run it." Naomi was still. "Not as an analyst," Arthur said. "Not as a consultant. As a senior executive with a permanent board seat and the authority to go anywhere inside the company and ask any question and require any answer." He met her eyes. "You spent 3 years doing this work with nothing. No resources, no protection, no authority to compel anything. You did it anyway, and you were right about everything. I want you to do it with everything the company can provide." The restaurant moved quietly around them. Somewhere across the room, a couple laughed softly at something private. A server cleared a table near the window. The ordinary, unhurried texture of an evening that had nothing dramatic left in it. Naomi looked at Arthur for a long time. "I'll need full independence," she said. "If I find something that implicates someone close to you, I report it and act on it. No exceptions, no conversations first." "Agreed," Arthur said. "And I'll need a team I choose myself." "Agreed." She was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded. They finished their coffee. The bill came and Arthur paid it, and they put on their coats and walked together through the dining room toward the door. Arthur paused near the entrance, one hand on the door, and looked back into the restaurant. The center of the room, an ordinary table, white cloth, a small candle in a glass, 2 chairs angled slightly toward each other the way chairs end up when people have been sitting and talking for a while and have stopped being formal about the geometry. He thought about that night, the worn coat, the rain, the way the room had looked at him before Naomi arrived at his table. He thought about a folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of a napkin by a woman who had decided something in 15 seconds and had been right about it in every way that mattered. He thought about Daniel coming home from that Memphis internship with a question about Gulf Coast routing that Arthur had been too busy to fully hear, and he thought about what it meant that the answer to that question had finally arrived. The smallest things. A note. A posture recognized from 30-year-old documentary footage. A woman who had been told her position was eliminated and had simply decided the position wasn't finished. "Ready," Naomi said from the doorway. Arthur let go of the door and turned. "Yes," he said. "Let's go." They walked out into the evening together, the restaurant behind them holding its ordinary noise and light, entirely unaware that it had been the beginning of something, proof, if it was needed, that the most powerful man in the room is sometimes the one who doesn't know a folded note is already on its way to his table. If the person closest to you had been quietly betraying everything you built, would you have seen it coming? Or would you have been the last to know? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories that prove the most dangerous enemies are never the ones you expect.